Okay, Pennywise Pauper, match 3 with Acid Trip. We're on the draw. We have another one-lander. Yet another one-lander. Only card draw we have to keep us going is a Spreading Seas. We don't really have any great early plays unless we draw exactly a white source. Yeah, I think this one-lander is a little bit too risky. There's no preordain is basically the biggest fault. This hand is fine. We got lands and spells. Can I afford to put a plant on the bottom here? Do I have the time? Yeah, I think I have the time to find some different lands. We'll get rid of that. Preordain and Seek at Oracle can find whatever I need. Turn 1 Dismal Backwater. That is something you do not want to see. Means we're probably playing against blue-black control. But if we're lucky, it's just blue-black Delver. Blue-black control is a very frustrating deck to play against with the mystical teachings, fetching up another mystical teachings, and counter spells and excludes and all kinds of good stuff. Whereas blue-black Delver is more of an aggro deck that's easier to beat. Alright, I'll just play a tap land and pass. If this is against blue-black control, our Spreading Seas get a lot worse because it's hard to turn them off of black mana entirely just with Spreading Seas. We don't have any counter magic main deck. Dimir Aqueduct picks up an island and they pass back. So here's what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to play Lone Missionary. And the reason for this is, if they don't get a pristine talisman online to be able to start gaining life every turn, basically any threat is good against blue-black control. And they're sort of forced to deal with it. So I just want to get the dinkiest threat online possible and force them to spend some mana killing it. Next thing that I'm going to do, since I have a spare Reality Acid, is I'm going to Reality Acid their Aqueduct. And it doesn't matter if they counter this, because I have another Reality Acid waiting in the wings, and I don't even have a bounce creature right now to pick it up with. If they do let it resolve, then at least it gets rid of their land in 3 turns. Worst case scenario. Although that is pretty bad for a worst case scenario. Basically what I'm trying to do is get our opponent to waste counter spells on spells that don't matter. But they have very intelligently, or very luckily, depending on what they're basing this on, decided that it's not a good idea to counter that. Oh, well, that's why. Our opponent is playing Recoil. Return target permanent to its owner's hand, then that player discards a card. Okay. I'll get rid of Journey Tunneler, I suppose. Interestingly enough, this works out just fine for us because Reality Acid triggers when it leaves the battlefield. So they triggered our own Reality Acid for us. I don't think they'll be doing that again. Okay, our opponent plays a tap land and passes. And we're going to be doing the same thing again here. We don't want them to counterspell one of our creatures that actually matter. So I'm going to Reality Acid one of their lands and see whether they want to counter this or not. They decide not to counter it. So one thing that I could do here is play Plains into Dreamstalker and really try to punish our opponent for letting it resolve. Or I could play Preordain. I think I'm actually going to go ahead and play the Dreamstalker. If our opponent does counter this, it's kind of bad for us because we want to take them off of their land, but it's not the end of the world because it's only a 1-power attacker. It doesn't speed up the clock that much. Our opponent is going to float a blue mana, presumably cast a spell after this Reality Acid leaves the battlefield. And they go with Think Twice. Okay. So far we've gotten rid of 3 mana worth of our opponent's mana, which is pretty good. The longer we can keep them from being able to cast Mystical Teachings, the better. So now we have 6 mana this turn, once I play this island. Which is pretty cool because it lets us Reality Acid plus Reality Acid, and just puts some inevitability on our opponent having lands. Alternatively, we could Seagate Oracle. I really like the plan of just continuing to troll with these reality acids, so I'm going to do that. I think it's actually the best plan, too. One of these days, our opponent might just get an itchy trigger finger and actually counter it. There we go. There's the counter spell. So now that the shields are down, I'm going to play Seagate Oracle, speed up the clock by a little bit more, maybe find something that can interact with our opponent. Well, 2 lands, so I'll take the one that can cycle away to an actual spell later. Our opponent passes without making a land drop. So now we understand why they countered that reality acid. Because they're pinched on lands finally. Alright. Once again, force our opponent to decide whether they think this land is worth it. They decide to capsize that land in response. Okay, that's a pretty cool play. So they're going to capsize that land so that reality acid is countered for lack of a target. I get to cast this Preordain unhindered. Dreamstalker and Seagate Oracle. Well, that's an interesting combination of cards. As weird as it is with only having a 1 power creature, I actually think that I want to draw this Dreamstalker. Just so I can put on that much more pressure on our opponent to do something. Grab this Plains here so I can cycle away the Secluded Steppe. We know our opponent can make a land drop this turn, but it's going to be a tap land that they just capsized, unless they drew something fresh. And our opponent should be on a 3-turn clock of attacks. Lead off with the Mulldrifter. See if our opponent has a Remove Soul or equivalent. They do not. Core Skyfisher. And I could cycle this step away, but I'm just going to continue being aggro, aggro, aggro. Evankar's Justice doesn't really even wreck us here, so I'm not going to pick up the Mulldrifter. Even though it could let me draw more cards, I'm just going to pick up a land. Alright, and our opponent concedes because they can't overcome early killing of their lands plus a quote-unquote aggressive start with our creatures. Whenever you're playing against blue-black control, unless you're another blue-black control deck, you're almost always forced to be aggressive, because Mystical Teachings can take over the game very quickly with a lot of different card advantage and being able to tutor up different instants that they need. Alright, let's get to sideboarding. So I want 2 Relic of Progenitus, 2 Dispel, and 2 Counterspell. I want to be able to stop their flashback cards, and I want to be able to interact with them on the stack. Stormbound Geist is pretty good if you can find a spot where they're tapped out and they can't counter it, then they have to spend 2 removal spells on it. Serrated Arrows is pretty useless against them, as are Faith Fetters. Spreading Seas are also pretty bad. It's nice if you can hit a bounce land with them, but so often it's not going to be relevant. So I'm going to get rid of those. And lastly, I'm going to ditch one of these reality acids. As good as it was just now, it's not going to be as good as it was last game most of the time. And we're going to try this. Okay, we are on the draw, and we have lands and spells, so I think that's good enough to keep. We have a Journey in our hand, which we really don't want early. Generally, if they play creatures, it's going to be very late in the game. They're going to be anglers, and it's going to be like very late when their opponent has taken over the game, and they know that they can counter any of our removal spells. Our opponent mulled to 6 and put a card on top of their library. Play our White Source. We could potentially run out Skyfisher turn 2 and turn 3 and just keep on picking up lands, but the deck we're playing against has enough removal that it would probably be ill-advised. For now, we'll just make land drops and see if we can force our opponent to blink first. There's a Think Twice. a land and passing the turn. Seagate Oracle. That's a good spell. If he wants to counter this, he can. If he doesn't, that makes my other creatures more likely to... well, if he doesn't counter it, then I can start attacking with it. If he does, then it makes my other creatures more likely to survive. We already have 2 bounce creatures, so I'd rather just keep the land drops flowing. Against a control deck, if you can make all your land drops and they start missing theirs, then you're doing pretty good. Our opponent has a Diabolic Edict, so Seagate Oracle is down. Duress. Okay, this Journey to Nowhere is going to go away. Our opponent knows we have no removal for an Angler if they so they can decide to play one soon if they have one. Aqueduct picking up a Dismal Backwater instead of a Radiant Fountain tells me that they have a 1 in a blue or 1 in the black spell to cast. I don't particularly want to run headlong into a Remove Soul or equivalent, so I'm not going to play the Skyfishers and take myself off of mana. I'd rather just hold out and play these Muldrifters for full value starting next turn. Dismal Backwater enters the battlefield again. And we have a Relic. That's interesting, but I don't think it's good enough. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play out a Muldrifter for full cost. If I play Relic, it probably just gets countered, and I don't particularly want that to happen. My dream here is that our opponent counters this, because that's basically the best that can happen for us. We can't really hope for much better. There's the counterspell, okay. Then next turn we draw an untapped land, play another Muldrifter. They counter that, and then I start to get Relic online. And we can stop their flashback spells, from, like Think Twice and Mystical Teachings, from having value. Our opponent's tapping out for a Pristine Talisman. I say tapping out, they still have plenty of mana available. So here's a good point where I can try to resolve this Relic. I could also play Muldrifter, but I can't hold up and counterspell at the same time, so I think this is better. And make our opponent start exiling cards. I'm going to play this Chancery. I think that over the long game, I'm going to want that Secluded Step in play. I don't particularly want to cycle it, so I'm going to pick up a tapped island and pass. Our opponent is flashing back Think Twice. I'm going to start basically every turn by making them empty a spell from their graveyard. So now I'm going to take this opportunity to try to resolve a Muldrifter. I would not put it past our opponent to have multiple counterspells in hand, but I have to try. Alright, our opponent is going to attempt to exclude this. We're going to attempt to counter back, and if this does not work, we are probably going to lose. Because our opponent's getting the additional value of drawing a card, since they have exclude. And we're getting the additional disadvantage of having the Muldrifter gone. Yep, there it is. So Condescend, we can't pay for it. Our opponent gets to scry 2, then draw, then untap with 5 cards in hand to our 3. They know about 2 of the core Skyfishers in our hand. We're not getting any additional value from the 3rd. Our opponent scryed to the bottom 2 times. And they get to take their turn. Alright, we draw Plains, which doesn't really do anything. We'll start by trying to resolve one of these Skyfishers with the intent of picking up the Secluded Step and cycling it. So that resolved, that's a start. We'll see if our opponent wants us to have another core Skyfisher on the table. Okay, we'll pick up something else. And I'm actually going to try to resolve this 3rd one. I don't believe there's anything that they could punish us with that does more than 2 damage to each creature, especially not an instant that they could search for with mystical teachings. So I'm just going to keep on picking up lands and playing out Core Skyfishers. If their plan is to remove these one at a time, then obviously that's pretty good for us. And our opponent does decide to exclude this last one. And there's the mystical teachings that we were afraid of. So let's see what they go and find. Another mystical teachings is a common first target. Agony Warp wouldn't be too bad here. Counterspell. Okay, our opponent's pretty sure they're winning on board and they just want to get a counterspell. We're letting them untap instead of cracking this relic to get rid of mystical teachings, because if we keep this relic around for longer, we could shut off more than just the single mystical teachings that's in the yard right now. Chainer's Edict. Okay. Now, if we go to exile with relic right now, our opponent can mystical teachings in response. So I'm not going to crack it at that moment. Our opponent is just outvaluing us at every turn here. I think I'm just going to play land and pass, save the Stream Stalker for some other time. Our opponent does decide to flashback mystical teachings. So this is the point where we could crack the relic to shut off the Chainer's Edict in the yard. And I think we kind of have to do that. We can't really beat it. We can't really beat anything from our opponent, honestly. Let's see if we find a Dispel here, maybe. And we don't. Our opponent goes and gets another Mystical Teachings. So now they have Counterspell, Mystical Teachings in hand, along with 2 other unknowns. Well, make that 1 other unknown. Our opponent's gaining 1 life a turn with Pristine Talisman, which is pretty awesome. Pristine Talismans allow you to ignore some number of cards on the battlefield, some number of creature cards attacking you. And Doomblade. So we now know that they exactly have Counterspell plus Mystical Teachings in hand. I'm kind of just waiting to see what our opponent does. I don't think there's any chance that we win this game, but I would like to see how they end the game, whether it's with Anglers or by milling us out with a Curse of the Bloody Tome or something like that. Just in case we want to inform our sideboard decisions. And I'll counter this just because he's tapped out and I know it'll work. It doesn't really matter either way. Evankar's Justice. Okay, so this is a pretty cool way for them to win the game. It has buyback, so they deal 2 damage to each creature and each player. However, because they have 2 Pristine Talismans active, it's basically like doing 2 damage to each creature and only me. So eventually they will kill me with it. So it is possible our opponent's running a completely creatureless version of blue-black control with no anglers, in which case I want to sideboard a lot differently. There are certain cards like Journey to Nowhere that basically do absolutely nothing at that point. So I'm going to concede the game. Our opponent has it locked up pretty tight, and we're going to go to sideboarding. So I think I'm going to assume my opponent's on the creatureless version and that I don't need to keep in these journeys for Gurmag Anglers. Our opponent could next level us and bring them in, but it's not what I expect to happen. I'm going to bring in these Core Sanctifiers for the Pristine Talismans, as well as 1 more Reality Acid and 1 more Spreading Seas. Now if our opponent does play an Angler, then we're going to have to deal with it with Reality Acid or blocking or erasing. Okay, game 3, we get to be on the play. Our hand is awful. We have 1 land, and we'd have to draw like runner, runner, land, 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 including blue to have a shot, so we have to mulligan this. This hand is fine, though not very exciting. Our opponent mulligans as well. We're going to keep our 6. Okay, preordain. I don't really care about that. I'm getting to scry 2 off of this preordain that I have in my hand anyway, so I want to see a lot of new cards. Lead with preordain. Preordain plus Dreamstalker. Dreamstalker doesn't really do anything right now, but I suppose at this point I will take another preordain. You might say, Jake, why did you scry the first preordain at the bottom and then scry that one at the top? Well, the first one, I knew that I was going to get to scry 2 again afterward, so I was looking for more interesting cards, maybe a Skyfisher to try to get some early aggression somehow and hope he doesn't have a removal spell. There's a Duress. The second one, I did not know that I was going to get the scry again afterwards, so... And I also didn't know that I was doing anything on my second turn, so I thought the second preordain was worth keeping. And right now it's going to go away because it's the only non-creature spell in my hand. Alright, play a tap land and pass. Blue-black control seems to have a very good leg up over other control decks in the format. If I was playing an aggressive deck, then maybe I'd have some interesting things to sideboard in. But as it is, my deck is too slow to really pressure them quickly enough, which means they have plenty of time to sit back and fire off their mystical teachings, find their duresses, and basically they have a lot of time to set up and get their engine online. Relic of Progenitus. So I suppose now is the time to try to make this resolve. I don't know that it'll be good enough to win. I really don't think it will be. But maybe it'll do something. Our opponent plays a land, passes. I'm going to play this Stalker, pick up the step, and plan to cycle it later. Our opponent has another Aqueduct, picks up their Swamp. Take this opportunity to cycle the step. And we can see what we can do about resolving a Seagate Oracle. I'm going to leave open the Chancery in case I draw a Skyfisher that I want to try to resolve. Although even if I drew Skyfisher, I probably wouldn't cast it, because I would assume our opponent had a counterspell. I guess this is worth fighting over. I don't have anything else going on right now. Dreamstalker or Plains? Well, Dreamstalker can pick up my Seagate Oracle again, but Plains can let me kick this Core Sanctifier, so I guess I'll do that. So we have a very, very slow clock on our opponent. They're making all their land drops. We have an active Relic, but I don't think that's enough. Heliod's Pilgrim, that's a cool draw. So the problem with this is they have a bunch of mana open, so we don't really want to cast Heliod's Pilgrim into it. At the same time, we also don't want to let them just Mystical Teachings. But our opponent can actually Mystical Teachings either way, because they have 6 mana available, so they could counter this for 2 mana and then Mystical Teachings afterward. So we're just going to play this and hope it doesn't get countered. If it doesn't, we can find a Spreading Seas and try to knock one of those Aqueducts down to being a producer of only 1 mana instead of 2. Okay, we get counterspelled. Life goes on. Our opponent didn't have a Mystical Teachings, but they did have a Think Twice on our end step. Chainer's Edict. Well, Seagate Oracle is better to pick up again, so I guess I'll keep that. I'm seriously considering cracking this relic right now because I have absolutely nothing else going on. I could also consider playing out this Core Sanctifiers. I think I'm going to crack the relic. I would like to be able to leave it online, but I need to be able to cast some more creature spells. Mold Drifter. Okay, Moment of Truth. If this resolves, I think I'm probably going to win because it means our opponent probably doesn't have any counter magic in hand. But our opponent probably does have counter magic in hand. Condescend. Okay, so that doesn't work. So there's certainly the argument to hold very good cards like Mold Drifter in your hand until you draw your sideboard cards like your Dispel and your Counterspell. But it's only so long until you find those spells. Our opponent could be duressing and figuring out what's going on in the meantime and setting up with a bunch of mystical teachings to be able to have all those counter spells by the time you try to cast Mold Drifter. So I think it's a little bit of a wash either way. If you wait, you make it more likely your opponent draws into counter magic in the meantime. If you do it right away, then you don't have any backup of your own. I'm going to replay the Seagate Oracle if they will let me. Our opponent's going to Mystical Teachings in response to this trigger. Presumably going to kill the Oracle so I can't pick it back up again. One of these weeks I'm going to have to play Blue-Black Teachings because it's very powerful. All the videos are going to go to time though. You see our opponent has 7 minutes less on their clock than we do right now. And they don't even have to attack or block. Recoil. So our opponent will recoil the Seagate Oracle and make us discard a card. Core Sky Fisher will go on the stack. So I suppose I'll return it itself because I can replay it after I replay this Seagate Oracle. I guess I can take a Lone Missionary just because it's a creature. And instead of replaying Skyfisher, I'll replay the Missionary. Our opponent has Mystical Teachings in Graveyard. And they did bring in the Gurmak Anglers. So who knows whether they had them game 1 or game 2, but they probably guessed that I was going to board out all my creature removal, at least after game 2, so they guessed correctly. Play a Skyfisher with the intent of picking up the Oracle and looking for more action. Dispel. Well, it doesn't beat the Angler that's already on the board, but it might help against something else. Alright, our opponent has Evankar's Justice. They're going to do that just to take out a Lone Missionary. That's fine. Alright. Go ahead and attack with this Core Skyfisher. Play another one and pretend like it's going to resolve. But we do have Dispel to protect it. So we're going to counter that. Don't really want our opponent to draw a card. And now we get to replay the other Skyfisher to untap it. And the Seagate Oracle. And we could attempt a triple block next turn. It'd be a very bad idea, but we could do it anyway. Alright, our opponent is transmuting Muddle the Mixture to go find a 2 converted mana cost card. Presumably a Chainer's Edict or an Agony Warp. Yep, there's a Chainer's Edict. So go ahead and pop out the graveyard now since there's enough things there to worry about. They have a Chainer's and a Mystical Teachings they could flash back next turn. Alright, maybe there's a way we can race this. I don't think there is because they have Chainer's, but attack for 4. And then we'll just cast both of our Core Sanctifiers for no value. If our opponent has no counter magic, And if they have 2 lands in hand and draw nothing but lands, then we could have a chance. I'm keeping this land in hand in case of recoil shenanigans where we want to save some other card later. Reality Acid. Okay, well, I don't think that does anything. Our opponent can go get a 1 converted mana cast card with Flashback Teachings and cast it. So let's see if they have a 1 converted mana cast removal spell. Oh, they have a Mystical Teachings in hand, so now that means they can go for up to a 3 mana removal spell. Agony Warp would be good here, yep. Agony Warp lets them kill a creature and also not take damage from the other creature, which makes it hyper efficient. Our opponent now has an Edict and 2 Mystical Teachings in the graveyard, so they're probably still going to win. Flashback Mystical Teachings, probably for another Edict. A Doomblade, okay. Take out the flyer. Yep, Core Skyfisher down. And the race is on. Well, there's Lone Missionary. That's kind of cool. A bounce creature would have also been cool to pick up that Reality Acid and get the Inkler out of there right away. Dismal Backwater takes him back up to 6. Flashback Chainers means I have to get rid of a creature. I wasn't planning on jump blocking yet anyway, so I got rid of the 1 toughness one. Counterspell. Is that good enough? Probably not, but maybe there's a way we win this game. Our opponent could also time out, which is a thing. Our opponent presumably wants to recoil this Gurmag Angler. I'm going to let that resolve. It will eventually kill us, but not anytime soon. Pristine Talisman. Do I care about that? Yeah, I kind of do. Because when this Angler goes away, I want to be able to kill our opponent with these Sanctifiers as fast as possible. Okay, I think we're going to be winning on time this game, which feels a little bit bad, but I mean, the clock, I've won on time once before in one of these videos, and the clock is a way that you can lose. Relic is a fine draw here. It shuts off Mystical Teachings in the graveyard. I'm going to go ahead and cycle it right now, so they can't untap with Teachings. And see what our opponent can do with 18 seconds and 2 cards in hand on 2 life versus 2 2-powered creatures. And our opponent concedes. So it's certainly possible that our opponent would have had to make the same lines of play even if they weren't constrained on time, and we would have won the match anyway. I'm not sure what our opponent's remaining card in hand was, but in any case, we took this down. If we do play blue-black control ourselves in the future, we have to make sure to know at all times exactly what we want to fetch with Teachings and be able to talk very quickly while we play, because I could see us getting in a similar situation where we're running low on time. Alright, on to match 4.